through what you're trying to.
Subcommittee on Information Technology will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Good afternoon. Today's hearing is part of a series of hearings the IT subcommittee has held to analyze existing laws and regulations that may have become obsolete or need updating to reflect technological advances. We've held hearings on health IT technologies, drones, autonomous vehicles, the Internet of Things, and many other issues. Today, we turn our attention to the laws and regulations governing political advertisements. The Federal Election Commission oversees civil campaign finance laws. It enforces disclaimer requirements for public communications from candidates, campaigns, parties, or political action committees related to federal offices. In addition, the FCC enforces additional disclosure and disclaimer requirements on broadcast cable, satellite, and radio ads. Some have proposed increased disclaimer and/or disclosure laws for ads placed on Internet platforms and have proposed a role for the FTC. The interplay between these three regulatory agencies and how they each apply the law is something the Oversight Committee is uniquely situated to examine, and I hope we dig into that today. Well, in many ways, this hearing is another example of the IT subcommittee's continued efforts to examine emerging technology. There's a level of urgency and importance to this hearing that cannot be understated. Since the sun rose on our democratic experiment, our adversaries have sought to destroy what our forefathers fought for. Our adversaries have always sought to use our nation's unique qualities to undermine our robust and resilient democracy, but now their tools have changed. As we've seen in recent months and weeks, Russia has attempted to influence our democratic process, utilizing, among other tools, political advertisements on major American social media platforms. With every technological advancement, our nation's regulatory posture has evolved to meet the changing needs of the day. Today, I hope to explore questions related to the need for reform of our nation's political advertisement laws and regulations. As always, I'm honored to be exploring these issues in a bipartisan fashion with my friend and ranking member, the Honorable Robin Kelly from the great state of Illinois. It's always good to be with you, Robin. I thank my colleagues and witnesses and my fellow citizens who have joined us today in person or who are watching online for participating today. Now it is my honor to recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Information Technology, Ms. Kelly, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. Today, we will examine federal laws and regulations governing political advertising just 1 month after Facebook revealed that Russians spent $100,000 to buy 3,000 ads to influence the 2016 election. Those ads reached 10 million Americans. These are just the numbers we know of. There are likely many more ads that were purchased directly or indirectly by the Russian government. U.S. campaign finance law prohibits foreign money in elections, but it allows foreign money to purchase issue ads. All political ads must carry a disclaimer, which discloses who the buyer of the ad is. But this requirement does not extend to digital ads like those that run on Facebook. The Russian government exploited these loopholes. In the 2016 elections, Russians were able to take advantage of our antiquated campaign finance rules and mounted effective misinformation campaigns on Facebook, Twitter, and Google. They micro-targeted their ads, sometimes posing as community activists with the intention of turning Americans against Americans. They sought to sway voters in critical congressional districts and swing states with fake news. The last time that the Federal Election Commission updated these regulations was April 2006, more than 10 years ago. That was before the iPhone had been introduced. Twitter was still in development, and the Facebook was only for college students. In fact, 35 of the 42 members of the Oversight Committee were not yet in Congress, myself or the chairman included. Much has changed in that time. A presidential candidate effectively used Twitter to wage a successful presidential campaign. It's time we recognize that in today's world, television and radio are not the only media carrying political ads. I am confident that we can prevent meddling by Russia and other foreign states in our elections while protecting the First Amendment rights of Americans. I was encouraged to see the FEC recently reopened its 2011 comment period on social media political advertising after these Russian meddling revelations. However, I am still concerned about the systemic problems within the FEC that have led to years of gridlock and inaction. We cannot continue waiting for action from the FEC. Our adversaries have shown they can act quickly and exploit our inability to enforce the law. According to a recent Marist poll, 64% of Americans want regulation on social media advertising, and an astonishing 78% of Americans want payment disclosure for political advertisements. I couldn't agree more. It's clear that Americans want transparency and more accountability in social media political advertising. Congress and the intelligence community need to fully investigate what happened in 2016. I commend the chairman for his leadership and willingness to hold today's hearing. Congress must work to ensure the integrity of our elections. Recently, Senators Warner, Klobuchar, and McCain, and Representatives Kilmer and Kaufman introduced the Bipartisan Honest Ads Act. This bill would increase transparency in online political advertising by requiring online advertising platforms to disclose copies of ads and their targeted audiences. This bill is a great start. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas on how we can protect our democracy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also ask for unanimous consent that Representatives Sarbanes, Kilmer, and Cartwright be allowed to join our subcommittee today and participate in the hearing.
Without any objection, so ordered. Thank you, Ranking Member Kelly. And now I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses. First, we have Mr. Alan Dickerson, the Legal Director at the Center for Competitive Politics, Mr. David Chaverne, the President and Chief Executive Officer at News Media Alliance, Mr. Jack Goodman, owner of the law offices of Jack Goodman, Mr. Randall Rothenberg, President and Chief Executive Officer at the Interactive Advertising Bureau, and Mr. N. Vanderwalker, Senior Counsel for the Brennan Center for Justice Democracy Program at the New York University School of Law. Welcome to you all, and pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before you testify. So please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your opening testimony to 5 minutes, and your entire written statement will be made part of the record. And I appreciate those written statements. It really was helpful in better understanding these issues. And for those that are looking for, a great outline of these questions we're going to be debating here today, I would suggest you go to the Oversight website to review those statements. As a reminder, the clock in front of you shows your time remaining. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up. So, Mr. Dickerson, you're up first, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Used to courts. Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to appear today on behalf of the Center for Competitive Politics. The Internet has fundamentally transformed the ways in which we communicate with one another, and it has become ubiquitous. It is on our desks, next to our alarm clocks, and in our pockets. Today, a large portion of Americans walk around every day carrying devices that can instantly connect them with anyone in the world from almost anywhere. In fact, in 2014, the Supreme Court reported survey data indicating that 12% of Americans use their cell phones in the shower. The Internet revolution has allowed Americans to absorb, produce, and distribute content without third-party intermediaries. They no longer need to see if an editor has accepted their letter to the editor or have to bear the expense and burden of buying broadcast political ads. As Judge John Kane, a Carter appointee, observed when he struck down a Colorado campaign finance law, it must be remembered that the Internet is the new soapbox. It is the new town square. In a way that makes the 1980s revolution in desktop publishing appear almost quaint, the Internet has made us all publishers, distributors, and speakers. Every American has the opportunity to be Tom Paine, to be Publius or William Lloyd Garrison, and one suspects that those authors would approve. Accordingly, as the Federal Election Commission itself has recognized, the blossoming of online speech and association is delicate, and great caution must be taken when burdening the speech and associational rights of American speakers. That does not mean, as I explained at some length in my written testimony, that online speech is a Wild West without rules. But it does mean that the current regulatory environment strikes a balance in favor of a flourishing civil society. Further efforts to license or regulate the placement of small bore issue advertisements, particularly those that do not advocate for any electoral outcome, will drive out the poorest and least sophisticated online speakers. They will inevitably affect not wealthy corporations, which can afford the experts to ensure compliance, but rather grassroots activists passionate about the issues of the day. Moreover, efforts to shift liability for unlicensed speech onto online platforms will simply require those companies to pass on those costs onto those same small budget consumers. And it will create incentives to limit small dollar ad buys and grassroots speakers in favor of sophisticated entities that can vet their speech in advance. The result will be an internet that is less free, less open, and less available to ordinary Americans. Of course, the internet also presents challenges. To take one example, foreign threats are a valid and a vital concern. But they cannot justify regulations whose burdens will fall overwhelmingly on Americans. The deterrence of foreign actors is a familiar problem. It is accomplished through means of diplomacy, counterintelligence, and military readiness. Campaign finance law, and in particular, the possibility of a fine levied through the FEC's civil enforcement authority, adds relatively little to that mix. Instead, additional campaign finance rules will further restrict access to the internet, the new public square, by average Americans in small groups. The First Amendment stands against those efforts. It is a bulwark against the passions of the moment and a reminder that our dedication to liberty and unfettered public debate is a strength and not a weakness. Nor does technological advancement change the Constitution's fundamental guarantees. The First Amendment rights to free speech, press, and association are not circumscribed merely because they become easier for the average American to exercise. As always then, when dealing with political speech, speech that the Supreme Court has recognized to be at the center of the First Amendment's protections, our guiding principle must be restraint. Thank you. I look forward to the subcommittee's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dickerson. Mr. Treverne, you're now recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the Subcommittee on Information and Technology. Thank you very much for asking me to participate in today's hearing. I represent the News Media Alliance, a nonprofit trade association representing nearly 2,000 news publishers across the United States. Our members include some of the largest global news organizations, as well as local newspapers, focusing on the issues that impact the daily lives of citizens in every state and congressional district. Alliance members share a common mission to inform society in an accurate, thoughtful, and responsible manner. Our member news organizations have long made substantial investments in high-quality journalism to achieve that mission. Our journalists and publishers are also held to high standards, as detailed in the American Society of News Editors Statements of Principles and the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. Not only are we potentially liable for knowingly publishing something that's false, our very brands are built on trust with our readers. Because of this, our commitment to truthful and accurate reporting has also informed our approach to advertising. Publishers have long played an important role ensuring the integrity of the advertisements that appear next to their content. When it comes to political advertisements, the legal responsibility for complying with Federal Election Commission rules clearly falls on the advertiser. Nonetheless, news publishers have taken an active role in ensuring that proper disclosures are made and that all ads placed in our publications reflect the honesty and integrity that's the foundation of our brands. As technology has evolved, publishers have carried forward our responsibility to provide accurate content and the internal controls that go with that to our digital products. These efforts are now much more difficult because of the growth of online platforms like Google and Facebook that act as intermediaries in the distribution of news, content, and advertising. Publishers previously worked to ensure the integrity of both their content and the advertising that appeared next to it, but now we have less control over advertising because of programmatic delivery of ads through ad tech platforms. These challenges are largely caused by the massive growth and inability to control an ecosystem that was built with a specific intention of not exercising responsibility over the integrity of content or the advertising that sustains its foundation. This is exacerbated by the fact that Google and Facebook now control the distribution and monetization of online news and information. They are the top two sources of traffic for online news publishers. They also collect most of the revenue, with Google and Facebook receiving approximately 71% of all digital advertising dollars in the United States last year, which includes political advertising. News publishers have worked tirelessly to respond to rapidly changing business models. My members now represent some of the most innovative and engaging digital publishers in existence, and we have created these new businesses without compromising in the integrity of our journalism. It is time that Google and Facebook and other online platforms do their part as well. And while they have profited greatly from their immense market power, they have yet to accept the full responsibility that comes with that position. When it comes to political advertising, Congress also needs to make the same adjustments that the rest of the economy is making and move away from a platform-specific perspective. My members deliver their news content wherever their readers want it, on desktops, in print, mobile devices, and even wearables. Within the bounds of the First Amendment, if Congress sees fit to impose requirements on certain kinds of political speech, then those rules shouldn't be defined by the delivery platform. And as a corollary, Congress should revisit the need for current platform-specific requirements to see if they appropriately apply to our converged digital world. If Congress continues to legislate by platform, then technology will simply continue to outpace the rules. The Alliance believes that the FEC rules should be updated to require disclosures within an Internet advertisement to identify the sponsor of an ad. Google and Facebook should also update their ad-driven business models and the opaque algorithms that accelerate the distribution of so-called fake news and viral messaging so that high-quality, reputable content is elevated in search and news feeds. I believe that these changes would lead to a healthier journalism industry, a better informed citizenry, and a more united country. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Goodman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jack Goodman. I am pleased to present testimony on political advertising. Although I have decades of experience working with broadcast stations on political advertising, I do not appear today on behalf of any present or former client, and the views I express are entirely my own. Broadcasters have long been considered America's most trusted source of news. Far more than any other medium, however, broadcast advertising involving politics is subject to detailed regulation. These regulations affect what ad stations must accept, the information about sponsors they must obtain and disclose to the public, and the prices they charge for political ads. In my experience, stations take their compliance efforts very seriously. The FCC's political broadcasting staff is exceptionally helpful, but even experienced broadcasters and their counsel frequently encounter questions as to which no clear answer exists. Disclaimer, as I will refer to it, is the information that must be included in ads about their sponsor. These are often referred to as sponsor ID requirements. Disclosure refers instead to requirements for sponsors of political advertising to reveal who they are and who determines their policies. Both the FCC and the FEC have rules governing aspects of both disclosure and disclaimer. Both agencies have sought to avoid conflicting regulations, and very importantly, both believe that broadcasters and their employees should not be required to serve as unpaid government enforcement agents or as unofficial private investigators. The FCC's disclaimer rule for all political advertising is that the ad must include a statement saying either paid for or sponsored by whoever is actually writing the check paying for it. These disclaimer rules limit the type of ads that stations can sell. Short messages cannot be used because the disclaimer will not fit. Thus, inflexible disclaimer rules can prevent the use of some formats for political speech. Turning to disclosure, broadcasters and cable systems must maintain public inspection files, including the political file. Television station public files are now online, and all stations will have their files online by next March. For candidate buys, the station is required to disclose the candidate, the requested schedule, and the cost of the ads. Disclosure requirements for non-candidate ads, which include both independent expenditures relating to elections and ads about issues or referenda, are more complex. The rules require detailed disclosure for any ad that communicates a political matter of national importance. The Act explains that these include references to a legally qualified candidate, any election to federal office, or a national legislative issue of public importance, and this definition is, to say the least, unclear. For example, is reference to a legally qualified candidate intended to encompass issue ads about state and local races? Determining what is a national legislative issue can also be challenging. If Congress is considering a gun control bill and a separate gun measure were introduced in a state legislature, would an ad opposing the state bill be subject to expanded disclosure? The requirements that issue advertisers disclose the sponsor's officers and the issues in the ad are also difficult to enforce. Some ad agencies simply refuse to provide the requested information. Stations infrequently receive orders for issue ads that do not identify any individual, or even if the station insists, are given only one name. Stations face similar problems in getting accurate information about issues in an ad. The rule is itself ambiguous. For example, if there are issue ads next year opposing Senator Kane's re-election in Virginia, is re-election of Senator Kane an adequate description of the issue? And what if an ad discusses more than one issue? Does each one need to be disclosed? Another problem can arise if time is reserved in advance and the advertiser does not decide what specific issue to address until just before the ad runs. Because of these problems, even the most conscientious station have great difficulties in obtaining the information that is supposed to be in the political file. In conclusion, experience with the FCC's political broadcasting rules is instructive. Any new rules applicable to broadcasters or other media need to be flexible to be adapted to new and varying speech formats. And if new disclosure requirements are created, the responsibility for collection should not be placed on the media, but instead on a government agency with authority to interpret the rules, investigative resources, and the power to impose sanctions for noncompliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Goodman. Mr. Rothenberg, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the honor of testifying today. I would like to get straight to the point. Throughout my 11-year tenure, the Interactive Advertising Bureau has always stood for greater transparency and disclosure in the digital advertising supply chain, regardless of whether the ads are political or commercial, because we believe transparency and disclosure are necessary for consumer safety and brand safety. So we strongly support efforts by this Congress and the Federal Election Commission to clarify, reconcile, and strengthen the disclosures required of political parties, candidates, and campaigns. But as a representative of the economy's fastest growing and most dynamic sector, IEB also believes that our industry itself can go even further to implement supply chain protections that would fortify the trustworthiness of digital advertising and media in political advertising and commercial advertising alike. IEB has a proven track record of taking and implementing responsibility across our 650-plus member companies. Together with multiple partner associations, we have created some of the media industry's strongest self-regulatory mechanisms, programs that have been lauded by the White House, the Commerce Department, and the Federal Trade Commission. Through the Digital Advertising Alliance's privacy program, we have provided consumers more control over their personal data in digital advertising environments. Through the Trustworthy Accountability Group's anti-fraud registry and auditing program, we have worked closely with U.S. and overseas law enforcement bodies to root criminal activity from the ad-supported Internet. We were warning about and guarding against Russian bot traffic years before it became a Washington concern. Our long experience with the diverse, innovative, and untidy world of advertising and media persuades us that in this industry, as in many others, there is a role for government regulation. But durable reform can only happen when the digital advertising community adopts tougher, tighter, comprehensive controls for who is putting what on its sites. Since its passage in 1971, the Federal Election Campaign Act has mandated disclaimers on all political advertising that expressly advocates the election or defeat of a candidate. But much of the fake news and fake ads at the center of the current storm did not engage in such overt candidate support. There were not a bunch of secretive Russian moles purchasing vote for Trump or Hillary for president internet banner ads. Rather, there were sophisticated posts about social and political issues, some of which were made more widely available because the operators paid to amplify them in people's social media feeds. Some of the scandalous messaging was not even placed for payment. Both social influence advertising and unpaid advocacy fall outside the scope of federal campaign disclosure rules. Americans have First Amendment rights to shout on street corners, put signs on their lawns, and post on social media without registering as political committees or reporting how much they spend on megaphones or smartphones. There is one more complex challenge in extending current disclosure rules to the Internet. The traditional regulations from the FEC and the FCC require disclosure by campaigns and by the media running the ads, for these are the media receiving the insertion orders and payments for those ads. In that world, the media are in full control. No programming of any sort runs on a television station or in a magazine that hasn't been vetted by those companies. In the digital world, by contrast, every page is cobbled together from multiple sources and assembled on the fly inside a user's internet browser. Articles, videos, advertising, sponsored links, and social commentary come together from scores of server computers. Underneath the visible page, scores of other suppliers may be contributing measurement, ad verification, and auction pricing services. Only a portion of the advertising is sold directly by publishers. The greater portion is sold and distributed by third-party technology companies which do their work via automated systems, programmatically in the industry parlance. Legislative proposals that would require websites to field expensive disclosure mechanisms create burdens on struggling media organizations, yet would barely capture the illicit political communication which is placed programmatically. This is why we would like the Congress's support for strengthening the self-regulatory mechanisms we already have built, by which digital media companies police their supply chains for bad actors and provide greater transparency into who is putting what on their sites. We can monitor the financing chain, whether the paid support takes the form of conventional advertising or whether it shows up in less familiar formats. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today.
Thank you, Mr. Rothenberg. Mr. Vander Walker, you're now recognized for your opening statement of 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Brennan Center for Justice, I thank the Subcommittee on Information Technology for holding this hearing. We appreciate the opportunity to share with you our recommendations concerning federal political advertisement laws and regulations, particularly as they relate to the ability of foreign powers to interfere in American elections. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan think tank and advocacy organization that focuses on democracy and justice and has studied campaign finance for 20 years, working to develop and defend effective and constitutionally sound policies. There are gaping holes in our regulation of paid political ads. In contrast to radio and television, much of the election spending on the Internet is untouched by key regulations. These include the requirement to report spending on mass media ads that mention candidates in the period before an election, the ban on foreign nationals buying such ads, and the requirement that broadcasters retain public files of political ads. It's time for this to change. The Internet is only going to grow in its importance to politics. The $1.4 billion spent online in 2016 was almost 8 times higher than 2012. Failure to subject ads on the Internet to the same disclosure regime as other media will leave the public without key information about who is trying to influence them. And it will allow more mischief from foreign adversaries like Russia's meddling in 2016. The Honest Ads Act, introduced in the Senate by Senators Klobuchar, McCain, and Warner, and in the House by Representative Kilmer, offers a promising framework to ensure such disclosure. Congress could also close other loopholes that allow secrecy and potentially foreign money, like spending by dark money organizations and foreign-owned corporations. These steps are surely needed. Investigations into the 2016 election have revealed a widespread, multi-pronged effort by the Russian government to alter the course of public debate by injecting propaganda and divisive messages into the American political discussion. As has been mentioned, firms linked to the Kremlin bought thousands of online ads on several major platforms that were seen by millions of people. The ads have still not been released to the public, but they reportedly discussed political issues, including messages advocating the election of candidates, all while the Russians disguised their identity with fake profiles designed to look like they were controlled by Americans. The intelligence community is confident that Russia will be back, and of course we must watch for copycats, China, North Korea, and even ISIS. Most immediately, this challenge to the American people's political sovereignty and the First Amendment values of transparency in politics requires updating campaign finance laws for the internet age. Congress should include paid ads on the internet in the definition of electioneering communications from the McCain-Feingold bill, which requires disclosure of expenditures above $10,000 on ads that mention candidates and certain mass media within a specified period. This would have two benefits. It would expand the ban on foreign spending, and it would increase transparency around online ads, making information about who is paying for them publicly available. In addition, online platforms should be required to maintain public files of political ads. That would essentially extend to the internet the Federal Communications Commission requirement that broadcasters maintain a public file of political ads. And online platforms, along with other businesses that sell ads, should be required to make reasonable efforts to prevent political ads from being sold to foreign nationals. All of these elements are present in the Honest Ads Act. Moving beyond the internet, holes in campaign finance disclosure rules allow dark money organizations to spend on politics without revealing their donors, potentially hiding foreign sources of funds. In order to close the holes, Congress should enact the Disclose Act. Another blind spot in campaign finance results from corporations' ability to spend in elections. Congress should expand the ban on foreign election spending to domestic corporations substantially owned or controlled by foreign nationals, as Representative Raskin's Get Foreign Money Out of U.S. Elections Act would do. Finally, these proposals, as well as existing laws, need vigorous enforcement. Yet deadlocks at the FEC have increased, and it has passed up chances to strengthen regulations. Congress can reform the agency, including by making the number of commissioners odd and requiring at least one member to be nonpartisan. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
I'd like to thank all the gentlemen for your opening remarks, and we're going to start the first line of questioning with the gentleman from Michigan. Mr. Mitchell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It appears to me that a number of the individuals testifying today are conflating general or social ads, opinion posts, admittedly political ads, and explicit political campaign ads, and conflating them all as being the same thing. As Mr. Rothenberg notes, there were a lot of sophisticated posts, I'm quoting, about social political issues, some of which were made widely available by operators, including those outside the United States. Now, let me ask you, Mr. Chafin, how are we going to determine what's fake news and real news? Who determines that for us?
Well, I wouldn't ask the platforms to determine it. I mean, fake news...
No, that doesn't answer my question, sir. Who determines that? If we're going to say we're going to stop fake news in some manner in America, and trust me, you should see my Facebook post. It's not exactly a wonderful thing to read some days, trust me. So who's going to determine what is fake news and stop it?
No one's going to determine what's fake news. There's a pre-existing. I agree with you that conflating political ads with bad content is incorrect, and there is a pre-existing regulatory regime about political ads.
Well, let me go on.
Okay, and then on the quote-unquote fake news front, there's a twofold problem. People get garbage over their news feeds online in the same way that good information is delivered to them.
I only have 5 minutes. I only have 5 minutes, sir. So let me ask the next question for you, which is a number of the newspapers that you represent printed a variety of articles about the upcoming tax reform and tax cut bill that's pending. They quoted a variety of sources as being that the rich are going to benefit, that the majority of the tax cuts are going to be for the rich, and quoted some sources. Did you detail the funding sources of those groups that made that quote?
With regard to those pieces or other pieces, you know who to complain to. You can complain to the publisher or the reporters.
With all due respect,
most of what we're talking about are things that
with all
cannot be
due
attributed.
respect, no newspaper in my community reported any of those sources. And in fact, as it comes to the tax bill that's pending, the tax brackets have not been published. The bill's not been published yet. Somehow, if you read the newspapers in my community, they've already determined how the tax bill is going to work based upon some groups that are funded by, I'll admit, progressive left groups that say immediately any tax cut is going to be bad. So my question for you is, if we're going to start being fair in terms of the information put out, would you not be responsible for posting that this comes from a group that's largely funded by, pick whatever term you want to do? Would you not post what their bias is? Why would you not do that then if you want to talk about it?
Congressman, what I would say is that you know who to complain to, which is the publisher and the reporters whose names are attached to that content,
well,
as opposed to most of what we're talking about today.
I assure you that it hasn't had much difference. The distinction I want to suggest to your group is that there's a difference between your response for the people you employ, their opinions they put forward. You note very clearly in opinion ads or opinion columns who the writer is. I've done a number of them. You're responsible for that content, or the individual that makes their opinion piece is responsible for the content. That's clear. The difference is on the internet posts, the provider, the intermediary is not responsible for it. They didn't write it. They didn't hire them. They didn't determine who they are. Yet you want them held to a standard that's like your newspaper in an entirely different format.
I wouldn't assert that, Congressman.
You did in your testimony, with all due respect. Let me move on real quick. I've got just a minute left here. Mr. Vander Walker, I mean, can you help me understand then, given your perspective on it, we're going to allow the federal government to determine what is appropriate content in social media? We're going to have them determine, well, that's a political ad, that's not. We're going to leave it up to a group of people to decide that?
Well, no. Sorry. The idea is to incorporate an existing framework that already is out there. The electioneering communications is a bright line test. Candidate mentions within a certain time period above a certain spending threshold.
Well, let me stop you, though. Clearly, the bright line hasn't worked. As Mr. Rothenberg notes and Mr. Dickerson noted, the reality is an awful lot of these posts that are now questioned as influencing the election fell well outside the bright line. So who's going to determine that?
Well, again, the bright line keeps you from having someone have to determine it. Certainly, there are things outside of the bright line, but you know, having a bright line and having people understand that they can post if it's below a spending threshold protects speech and protects the ability of people to talk about legislative issues without having a decision maker have to make judgment calls every time.
Well, let me suggest to the group, and I've suggested internally here to other members, our first responsibility here is to protect the Constitution. The First Amendment is the First Amendment for a reason. We need to defend that, even if some people think it's fake news, because one person's opinion on fake news is another person's opinion. And the idea that we're going to allow a group of regulators, a group of bureaucrats to regulate what we'll be able to see in terms of social media or other formats offends me, and I will certainly oppose that in any way I can. Thank you very much. I go back.
The Honorable Robin Kelly from Illinois is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In January of this year, the intelligence community released its assessment that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign aimed at the U.S. presidential election. According to that assessment, and I quote, Moscow's influence campaign followed a Russian messaging strategy that blends covert intelligence operations such as cyber activity with overt efforts by Russian agencies, state-funded media, third-party intermediaries, and paid social media users or trolls. Only 1 month ago, as I said before, Facebook revealed that a company linked to the Russian government bought 3,000 ads aimed at amplifying divisive issues. These ads are believed to have reached 10 million people in the United States. To be clear, this is just the ads we know about and people they've reached. There are likely to be more advertisements bought and concealed due to the nature of digital advertising. Mr. Vander Walker, are our current laws and regulations sufficient to prevent future influence campaigns by foreign actors? If not, why not?
Well, unfortunately, too much of the internet is left out right now. We have, as I mentioned, a regime that applies to political spending in mass media, and at the time that that regime was enacted, the important mass media were covered, but now the internet is far more important than it was then, and it's only gaining in importance. And it should be brought into the regime that exists so that spending above certain spending thresholds on electioneering communications should be covered. A similar requirement to disclosures for political ads under the FCC rule for broadcasters should be applied to internet ads as well when they're paid for.
Okay. Mr. Rothenberg, your testimony characterized this as a supply chain issue. What do the members of your industry that are a part of that supply chain need to do to prevent this issue?
I think they need to participate in both our existing programs of industry-wide self-regulation that have been very successful. We've built them to give consumers disclosure and control over their privacy, over their data flows in digital advertising environments, and we've built another that requires disclosure to prevent fraudulent activity from taking place. So I think we need much more aggressive participation in those, and we would welcome Congress's support for that. And I think we can build out from those programs to create better conditions for not just disclosure, but I call it supplier qualification. I mean, basically, if you take a couple steps back, if you think about your local supermarket or even something as large as your local Walmart, nothing goes on those shelves without it having gone through a series of sluice gates that give everyone a bit of assurance that those products are safe. We have created mechanisms that can do the same thing, and I think we ought to build out those mechanisms and get more comprehensive participation in them.
Thank you. Besides lax self-regulation of advertising appearing on social media, there's also the proliferation of fake accounts. On Election Day, thousands of fake accounts coordinated messages aimed at disparaging Secretary Clinton and Democrats. Mr. Shavern, print media still contains a large amount of advertising. What are its responsibilities in terms of political advertising?
Well, its responsibilities are those that it's traditionally had and upheld, which is to develop a safe and trusting environment for its readers. Most of our content is now delivered digitally, and the biggest things we can do there are let people know where the information has come from. What is the source of the information? The biggest issue from my perspective with quote-unquote fake news is that it comes out of nowhere, people don't know where it comes from, and it's fed to them in the same way that other legitimate news is fed to them. So the best thing that any platform or news source can do is be clear about where the news is coming from, what the source of it is.
Just out of curiosity, do you, with print media, do you feel like, you said you want to provide a safe and trusting, do you feel like most of your readers feel that way or trust what they read?
I think they do find we have an extremely loyal and actually growing audience for our news product. The audience for our news product is bigger than it's ever been in history across all the platforms. And the fact of the matter is people want credible information about the world and their community, and they primarily come to us to get it.
Should digital political ads be held to a different standard than political ads in other media?
No. I come back to we're in a platform agnostic world where you get information 16 different ways, which is all good, but the rules can't be divvied up by platform. We're going to need to come up with a set of rules that goes with the content, not with the platform.
Can I ask one more? What do you think that you can do to do a better job helping readers distinguish between the real news and content that comes from questionable sources or the fake news?
I mean, there's always been crazy conspiracy theories. I think we've all got uncles over the Thanksgiving dinner who's told us crazy stuff. But that's always been different from the newspaper on your driveway or what's on TV. What's happened now is that it all gets put in a blender and fed to you so that the real news sources and the crazy conspiracy theories come the same way. You don't want the platforms or anybody else censoring content, but you need to give readers more information. You need to indicate much more clearly where it's coming from. And these algorithms to which we are all subject to in our lives need to give credit to people who actually pay reporters for real reporting.
Thank you. I yield back.
Now I'd like to recognize my friend and colleague from the great state of Texas, Mr. Farenthold. You're now recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Sharon, Ms. Kelly asked you a question I don't think you adequately answered. Are there any federal government regulations on a political ad that's placed in a newspaper? Is there anything a newspaper has to do?
As,
by law.
as the primary responsible party, no, it's on the advertiser is the
All
primary
right, so
responsible
there's, and you say federal regulation should be platform neutral. So it would also, by extension, be the federal government should not place any regulations on internet platforms as well and treat them the same as a print newspaper. Is that correct?
As long as the regulation around the advertisement itself is the same. As long as, if there are disclosure regulations on whoever they're from, they have to be, whether it's online or on your watch. You know, people are consuming content in every way. So the requirements, whoever they may fall on, should fall without regard to the platform.
All right, so Mr. Rothenberg, is there anybody on the panel who disagrees with that?
Well, I would just add one kind of coda to it. The law has long, and I would defer to Mr. Goodman on this too. Law has long recognized that broadcasting is different because of the scarcity.
Yeah, the scarcity of the airways held in public trust. I'm a no radio guy.
Right. So with that as a known exception, platform agnosticism makes sense. Yes.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about, there's a difference in the way that ads are placed. There's been a lot about, who's buying these ads and the disclosures. Typically in a newspaper, you actually probably talk to a salesman or you talk to somebody on the phone. If you're going to buy something on an online platform, it's typically done online. Let's say I'm Boris or Natasha from Moscow and have a pile of rubles I've converted into American dollars. I go buy a cash card, Visa, rent a post office box, and ain't nobody going to know I'm a foreign national. Do you see that as a problem? Yes, Mr.
Yeah. Well, as I said in my testimony, and it's not necessarily a popular point of view across my entire industry, every company should know to some degree of comfort and certainty who it's doing business with. That's a fundamental principle, whether you're making a car or whether you're running a grocery store. So I think that it is not just possible, but necessary to have some kind of supplier qualification and customer qualification safeguards in place.
All right, so now let's go to the other problem that people are complaining about in social media. I think there's, you may actually have more effect in elections on, say, Twitter or maybe Facebook with bots. Just posting something at no cost. A bad actor may go spend $100,000 hiring a programmer to create bots and start posting stuff. Is there a technological way to detect that? I understand that's a problem in the industry worldwide, dealing with bots. What do you do about that, and how do you not get legitimate people who are trying to exercise their First Amendment rights wrapped up in that?
Sir, you have just identified the absolute total nut of the problem, the dilemma. But it's not unsolvable. I don't think you can come up with anything that will ever be 100% foolproof because the technology is very low barrier to entry and will always evolve. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. They're always going to find new ways to do things. But I keep coming back. I'm sorry I sound like a broken record. Nobody actually knows what a record is these days. But I'm sorry I keep repeating myself. But I think elements of supplier qualification, knowing with whom you're doing business up and down the supply chain, and building that into a comprehensive self-regulatory program will go,
so
and we have proof that it goes a long way to reducing the incidence of bot traffic.
Under some sort of self-regulatory program, you're going to have the ability of a social media platform or website operator or whomever to reject something. Where do you draw the line that they're being treated fairly? Let's say I start Blake Oogle or whatever the new search engine is, and I'm going to turn down all ads from liberals because I'm a conservative. How do we address that?
Well, first of all, it's your right. You can do anything you want. and prevent anybody you want from coming on. If you want to grow and you want to create a larger business, you want to be as open as possible. So you have to find a balance. I know that may come off as a little mealy-mouthed, but there is a balance between using technology systems and human oversight to determine the quality of your supply chain participants.
But how does somebody know then, for instance, say my algorithm to determine what's in a user's news feed? I could subtly weight that to conservative messages, and it might be years before somebody figures that out.
It's true. The same has long existed in every other medium as well. There has been political bias. Sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's not so subtle.
You find that on cable news, I'm sure. That's how you choose your channel, I think, these days.
And you choose your technology.
Right. Thank you very much. I see my time has expired.
Now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you for calling this a really important hearing. Mr. Rothenberg, you've spoken eloquently about building integrity into the supply chain, which then leaves the obvious question, what went wrong in 2016, and why are we in the situation we're in? Why didn't that happen?
Well, to quote a former Secretary of Defense, you can't plan for the unknown unknowns. We did very explicitly, and going back over the 11, 12 years I've been in this job, working with our partner associations, the Association of National Advertisers, the 4As, which represents the agencies, the Data and Marketing Association, built very effective self-regulatory programs for known knowns, consumer privacy controls, for bot fraud. But nobody had anticipated illicit Russian actors.
Gotcha. So you think you're ready next time, or you're getting ready for next time?
Well, I was in...
Intelligence agencies say they're coming back.
Oh, they will be.
As early as 2018.
They will be, but I'll give you kind of a warning born of my older profession. Way back in my dark past history, I covered politics and political media for the New York Times. And I developed a principle back in the late 80s that we're always covering the last election. The media and the way communications happen are always outrunning our thoughts about what's going to happen. I don't think anybody anticipated the degree to which Twitter was going to be a massive social influence, let alone bots. So yes, I think we can very much be prepared for the bot traffic problem, but we don't know what mole is going to pop up in that game next time around.
Thank you. Mr. Van Der Walker, let me switch to you. You've made what seems like the intuitively obvious point that the internet is properly analogized to TV and radio in terms of the medium, in terms of its impact, in terms of how it works, and therefore the rules that apply to electioneering communications in the TV context and the broadcast context should also apply in the internet. And all of us are familiar with that. We have to say that we paid for this ad and we stand by this ad and all that kind of stuff. But what about the problem, which has kind of been floating around from the beginning of the hearing, that it seems as if of the hundreds and hundreds of Facebook pages and Twitter messages and bots that were put out by the Russians, many of them were just meant to sow chaos and to inject poison into the American body politic. They would not fall within the electioneering communications definition that we've got under the McCain-Feingold legislation. Can anything be done about that, or is it, as Mr. Rothenberg is suggesting, that, well, we've learned our lesson from 2016 and now the public is going to be much more wary, or should be, and the media themselves and the internet companies themselves should try to be on top of this problem?
Right. I mean, I think, as you noted, we should close the doors that we know we can close. I don't think that's all that can be done. For example, the political ad database encompassed in the Honest Ads Act actually goes beyond electioneering communications because it involves issues of national legislative importance, and so would create a publicly available record that researchers could use to try to piece together what's coming from where, who's being targeted, and what are the messages. That could be, I think, extremely valuable in understanding what the sort of next attacks are and how to respond. And then I think there are more things to be done sort of outside the realm of campaign finance, and that's going to require industry and Congress working together in the ways that Mr. Rothenberger has proposed and really figuring out how to get on top of this thing.
Let me ask you another question. The Supreme Court in the Blumen decision upheld our traditional ban on foreign nationals spending money in U.S. elections. That's not covered by Citizens United if they are not a U.S. individual or a corporation. However, foreign money could take over domestic corporations, as you were suggesting before, and then money could be channeled through this Citizens United loophole directly into the political system. Is that something that you think we can tighten up as well?
Yes, definitely. Regulation has in many ways not caught up with Citizens United, even though it was several years ago now. Corporations' ability to spend unlimited amounts on politics, either directly or through super PACs, requires dealing with the problem that even a domestic corporation can be wholly owned or controlled by foreign powers. And that should be tightened up. One of the ways would be to, as has been proposed, set some kind of percentage, or ownership percentage by foreign nationals or foreign governments, and say above this, even a domestically cited or incorporated corporation can't spend on politics.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I yield back.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes. This question is to everybody on the panel. You can say yes, no, you can elaborate. Just don't take too long if you're going to elaborate. And Mr. Vander Walker, I'm going to start with you, and we'll go your left to y'all's right. Laws like the Federal Election Campaign Act, McCain-Feingold, Supreme Court cases like Citizens United, do those refer to, and should those cover all political advertisements, whether express advocacy or issue advocacy, despite the platform? Mr. Vander Walker.
Yes, I think our campaign finance regime at its heart is about transfers of money designed to influence politics. Whether that means buying a political ad, writing a check directly to a candidate, there are different ways that can play out in detail, but yes, I think
Mr. Rothenberg
for politics.
No, opinion is protected. Issues are protected. That is not just a slippery slope. You're already 3/4 of the way down that slope. When it's about candidates and about actual advocacy for or against a candidate, then clearly that falls within the scope of existing law.
And that's what I asked. I asked specifically for express advocacy. You should, vote for this guy or don't vote for that guy.
Sure, that's
or
easy.
the issue saying call your congressman if this. In any of those types of political speech, should that fall under these laws and Supreme Court cases, despite the medium, whether it's you're writing whether you're sending a piece of mail in the mailbox or it's a digital ad?
Yes, they absolutely can. You've got to make certain adjustments for the differences among the media. You can't have video rules applying to audio and vice versa. But yeah, sure.
Mr. Goodman.
I agree that under the court's precedents, it doesn't matter the medium. To the extent speech can be regulated under those cases, it doesn't matter how you say it.
Yes, as to express advocacy, you get beyond that, you get into tremendous free speech issues.
My First Amendment expert, Mr. Dickerson.
Yes,
Microphone, please, Mr. Dickerson.
I'll learn that eventually. Yes, as regards as involves platforms, with a caveat, which is that the amount of money that is being regulated is important. The fact that it is cheaper to run an ad in some media versus another doesn't change the burdens on the speaker and their resources in complying with a regulatory regime. So, in that sense, if we're talking apples to apples, certainly.
So, if somebody, coming from the great state of Texas, where I'm in the only competitive district in the state, I'm very familiar with all of the political advertisements that may or may not be run against me. If somebody's running ads against me, there's a public file. I'm Mr. Chavern, is that correct? Or I guess Mr. Goodman, I think let's say if they're doing it on television.
If they're doing it on a radio, television, there's a public file, and depending on whether they are your opposing candidate or an independent group, different information would be in that file.
And what law governs that?
It's largely the Communications Act, and there were amendments to that act by the McCain-Feingold Act in 2002.
Mr. Chavern, is that same for print?
In terms of there's no public file.
Public file. Like, do I know how?
No, there's not a public file requirement. And as a matter of fact, I would take this opportunity. I think this is a time where Congress can look and see what requirements are needed for across the platforms. You know, we have different requirements now. I think looking forward, you have to say what's rational and required. And for example, do you need a public repository when you have the internet? But you know, currently the rules are different.
Or should it be available on the internet?
Right.
Mr. Rothenberg, you obviously know you're next.
Well, on that one, I think
when it comes to specifically digital platforms.
You're talking about the public file?
Public file, yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's hard under the law and under First Amendment history to require the public file to reside with different media. It's hard to take something that was based on the stewardship of the airwaves and port it over to something as open and diverse as the internet. But what I don't understand is why you can't place those requirements on the campaigns themselves. They know what they're spending. They know where they're spending it. They can create the public file, and that would be available across all media, rather than burdening the end nodes, the edge providers.
So my first question to all of y'all were the rules that govern express advocacy should apply to all mediums. But we're saying when it comes to the public file and making sure that what advertisements are and timing and amounts that should only apply to broadcasters? Is that what I just heard?
Interesting. What I would say is you can apply it, but you should place the burden on the campaigns, not on the media that are not responsible for selling the ads.
Mr. Dickerson, can you help me understand any First Amendment issues with this notion of a public file?
Well, I mean, the most basic is that it's not costless.
It's not
costless. I mean, it's necessarily burdening speech in the sense that certain types of advertisers have to do things that others don't. We've largely lived with that because, you know, as I explained in my written testimony, the sort of speech that's being done on broadcast tends to be larger amounts of money, more sophisticated actors. There are human beings in the mix who are making these determinations as to express advocacy.
So are you saying that I should have to do it on television, but somebody else shouldn't have to do it in another medium? If somebody's running against me and they shouldn't have the same?
I mean, I personally would question the utility of a lot of the exercise in the sense that I'm not sure this information is actually used in ways that are useful from a First Amendment standpoint. But if we are going to have them, we need to be careful to ensure that only the sort of sophisticated actors like political campaigns and that only the sort of speech that is clearly about election.
Yeah, and I want to make sure I'm clear. When I ask questions, it's narrow, express advocacy and issue advocacy. Mr. Dickerson, I appreciate that. Now I would like to recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to take a special moment just to thank you and to thank Ranking Member Kelly for holding this hearing. This is incredibly important. I want to thank the panel members as well. And although Ranking Member Kelly mentioned that, you know, it's only been a month since Facebook came out and said, yes, the Russians did purchase $100,000 on Facebook to influence the election, it has been a very long time since members of Congress have been asking to have an investigation on the interference of a foreign government, in this case Russia, with our democratic elections. It goes back a long way, and this is the first time, Mr. Chairman, you are the first. You are the first to hold a public hearing on the hacking of our election. And I want to thank you for that. I mean, we go all the way back to September 2015 when the FBI actually contacted the DNC to say the Russians are hacking your website. And the Democratic National Committee did not act promptly on that warning, and so the hacking continued. And then in June 2016, it became public of the Russian hacking, widely reported. In December 2016, every single one of the U.S. intelligence agency heads went public and said that with high confidence, this is December of 2016, with high confidence, they could say that the Russians were hacking our election. In September 2016, Senator Feinstein and Representative Adam Schiff came forward, and they said, based on their positions as ranking members of the Intelligence Committee, they had information from their hearings that the Russians were hacking our elections. And yes, again, last month, Facebook came out and said, yeah, the Russians purchased with rubles $100,000 in ads and interfered with our elections. So all that happened, and today's the first day of the hearing. Today's the first public hearing that we're having on the infringements made by a foreign government on the United States elections. That's shameful that it took so long. And so I'm going to, we're talking about campaigns in general and limitations on campaign advertising. But again, I'm going to repeat my request. And when I say repeat, back in December 2016, December 14th, I submitted this letter to the chairman of our committee at that time, Mr. Chaffetz, asking him for a hearing on the Russian interference with our election. No response. On April 3rd, 2017, I repeated the effort again, wrote a letter to this committee saying, look, this is the Oversight Committee. This is our national election. Can we please have a hearing on the Russian interference with our election? No response. Again, I joined this time. I thought maybe it was just me. So I asked all my colleagues to join with me to a letter to Jason Chaffetz and also the Honorable Bob Goodlatte, Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, on May 16, 2017. Could we please have a hearing on the Russian interference in our election? It's very, very important to our democracy. They hacked the RNC and the DNC, both parties. We should be bipartisan about the integrity of our elections. And again, up to today, no action. And we're having a hearing today on political advertising, but we still haven't had a single hearing, single public hearing on the Russian interference in our election. Ironically, today I did learn in Politico that Mr. Goodlatte has announced the 11th hearing on the Clinton investigation, on the Hillary Clinton investigation, the Department of Justice investigation of Secretary Clinton. So it's, we got to get together on this stuff, and I know it might be painful for everyone. I actually asked Ms. Wasserman Schultz, would she come and testify? Yes, she said she would. It would be difficult, but she would. She would come and help us to delve into what actually happened. So let me ask you, with my remaining 30 seconds, Mr. Vander Walker, you're familiar with the Honest Ads Act that my friend Mr. Kilmer and Senator McCain have put out there. Seems straightforward. Give me your opinion on that, please.
We think it's the Brennan Center takes the position that it is an excellent framework to apply to to address the problem of political spending, which to close doors on foreign spending that can come in and affect elections by bringing the internet into an established framework that exists for political spending and other mass media.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Lynch, thank you. And I appreciate the kind words, but I also want to highlight that there have been a number of hearings open and closed on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence.
I haven't seen them.
Yeah, on the issue of this. But this, again, making sure that we're glad we have this, doing this in a bipartisan way. And with that, it's now a pleasure to recognize the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having these hearings. I find it a remarkable moment in our democracy when so many up here apparently can see and hear no evil when it comes to Russian interference with the American election process, irrespective of who benefited, but can beat a dead horse when it comes to what kind of server was used for somebody's emails. I think that's an indictment of the enabling and complicit behavior we have seen all too much of since Mr. Trump was signed in as President of the United States. What could be more sacred than protecting everyone's franchise and the integrity of that process in a democracy? And when it is interfered with, deliberately, strategically targeted by a foreign adversary, not an ally, an adversary, why wouldn't we be doing everything in our power on a bipartisan basis to make sure that can never happen again? And that's really the context of this hearing. Mr. Goodman, from a legal point of view, in my state, the great Commonwealth of Virginia, when I do a campaign ad, if I do one, I'm required by law at the end of it to have a trailer saying, I paid for this, this is my campaign ad. It's a stand by your ad kind of requirement in law. In a sense, that's circumscribing my free speech, is it not?
To some extent, it is the courts have so far never questioned the ability of the government to require disclosure. And with respect to one part of that, which is I'm Gerald Connolly and I paid for this ad, that at least with respect to the FCC is something you can choose to do or not do, but if you don't do it, you are not entitled to the candidate discount rate.
Right.
So it's your choice.
But the point here is there's precedent for circumscribing certain forms of political advertisement.
No one has ever questioned those particular requirements, to my knowledge, in court, but the Supreme Court has, in all of its cases, said that disclosure is largely the remedy, and I would think this would be within the scope of disclosure.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Vanderwacker, given the fact that there is precedent, that's one example, there are lots of other examples of circumscribing what otherwise would be free speech. Tobacco advertising, example. The government makes a producer of a certain product actually add words to its packaging it does not want to add, but that are required by law. So there's precedent. No one wants to infringe the First Amendment, but one of our friends on the other side of the aisle earlier made it seem as if the choice were, gut the First Amendment or deal with this problem. And it seems to me those are not the only two options in front of us. Your comment.
That's right. There are sort of limits on the amount of speech in various ways, and it's important to recognize that there are First Amendment interests on both sides. That is, the listener has an interest in knowing who is speaking to them so that they can evaluate that message. The sort of democratic interests in voters knowing who's piping up for a candidate. That tells you something about what that candidate stands for. Holding candidates accountable for the financial support that they get, as well as being able to evaluate, is this message, about some political issue coming to me from an environmentalist group or an oil industry, and do I trust which one of those, and taking those sorts of things into account.
I'm going to run out of time, so let me just, do Boris and Natasha operating from the Dasha in the outskirts of Moscow, trying to corrupt American democracy through multiple social media and digital ads, do they have the same unfettered First Amendment rights that anybody else does in the United States?
No.
They don't. Why not?
Well, for a number of reasons. Constitutional rights in general are diminished at most, at the very least, and for foreign nationals not within the United States. But also it's important to note that in the democracy sphere, as noted in the Blumen opinion that was referenced earlier, we have this self-governing community. We are governing ourselves. And that is why we have a democracy and a First Amendment that allows political debate, and others do not necessarily get the right.
And therefore, we have a right to protect ourselves from Boris and Natasha.
Right.
Thank you.
Mr. Krishnamurthy, you're now recognized for your 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd and Ranking Member Kelly, for holding this important hearing on our political advertisement disclosure laws. regardless of our political affiliations, we all agree that our elections are the cornerstone of our democracy, and transparency and the security of elections must be protected at all costs. Foreign efforts to undermine both our elections and the elections of other Western democracies must be taken seriously. This Congress has a responsibility to ensure that all future elections are protected against foreign meddling. Mr. Vanda Walker, we've heard today the suggestion, and we've seen in at least written testimony, that Russian internet ad buys were just simply too small to be considered a nefarious foreign influence, given the actual amount of money spent on electioneering ads versus other means of Russian propaganda. Would you agree with the idea that any effort by a foreign adversary to sway our elections, regardless of whether or not those efforts have a significant impact on the outcome of an election, are troubling?
Yes, I mean, first of all, we don't know the extent, so that we haven't seen the maximum figure. But yes, any amount of, again, trying to influence American elections contrary to our self-sovereignty is problematic.
Mr. Vanda Walker, earlier this month, Facebook stated that about 10 million people had seen these ads. How concerning would you say those estimates are, and how does that impact the public's trust of our news media and our democratic institutions?
Right. I mean, I think it's very troubling, and again, that should not be considered an upper bound. Facebook said that that was the audience that the paid ads reached. Those same profiles produced unpaid content that reached potentially tens of millions more. We don't yet know. And that's one of the problems with not having very much disclosure in this area, is that we actually still don't know the extent of the reach. And we need more information about who's trying to sway our political opinions.
So it may have reached tens of millions of people, not just 10 million. Through the purchase of thousands of ads and the use of Russian-linked accounts or bots on various social media platforms, Russia's government was able to manipulate the Internet's open access to information to spread lies, inflammatory rhetoric, and other propaganda in the hopes of swaying voters, both in the United States and France, among other places. Multiple news reports found that on Facebook alone, there were hundreds of profiles linked to Russian agents that spread false information regarding one of the presidential candidates, as well as issues like immigration, guns, and other divisive topics. During the French elections, there were similar efforts to spread false information regarding one of their presidential candidates. Mr. Vanda Walker, one final question. In your opinion, are we taking, as a body in Congress, the issue of foreign infiltration of our Internet sites seriously enough?
I think there's been a lot of discussion from our perspective at the Brennan Center. We value transparency, which is crucial in elections always, and is especially crucial now to address this foreign influence. We certainly think more action could be taken. There are bills that have been introduced that would help address this problem.
Do you anticipate that the Russians and others are going to continue these efforts in the ramp up to 2018?
Everything I've seen from the intelligence community indicates that, yes, they are.
Thank you.
The gentleman from the great state of Washington and a friend, welcome to the Oversight Committee. You're always welcome. Love to see you at future hearings. You're now recognized. Mr. Kilmer is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chairman Hurd and Ranking Member Kelly, both for overseeing this important hearing, but also for letting me sit in with your subcommittee. Our democratic republic, that system in which we, the people, are the boss, has become vulnerable to foreign actors that want to disrupt our system of government to influence electoral outcomes. And from the reports that we've read so far, foreign actors targeted American voters to have the maximum impact on our elections. And that's unacceptable, and that's something, thankfully, that both Democrats and Republicans have agreed needs to be stopped. That's why we introduced the Honest Ads Act, myself and Congressman Kaufman, with input from my good colleague Representative Sarbanes and Senators Klobuchar, McCain, and Warner. And our bill would have the Federal Election Commission enact rules for online advertisements similar to what's already in place for TV and radio and satellite ads. Those rules require disclosure of who's buying what ads where. And that's vital if we're going to ensure transparency, to affirm the public's right to know. And it's important that if we're going to, that's increasingly important if we're going to keep foreign money out of our politics. Just based on some of the comments that have been made, I think it's important to acknowledge requiring disclosure when someone purchases a radio or TV ad does not prohibit or inhibit free speech, nor does holding those purchases in a public file. The Supreme Court has long recognized that commercial speech, such as political advertisements, is not subject to the same protections as a citizen's comment to speak up in the public square. I appreciate Mr. Chavern's comment that applying those disclosure requirements to Internet-based advertisements should be no different than what happens with radio and TV media. And I also appreciate Congressman Raskin's comment that certainly this bill doesn't solve all of the problems that we saw in this last election cycle, but this would at least solve the discrete issue of the public's right to know whether a foreign actor is trying to purchase an ad on the Internet. So I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to try to limit them. First, for Mr. Rothenberg, because you spoke to the challenges associated with, perhaps the burden of keeping the file. If the public file requirement were on the purchaser of the ad or on the campaign, I guess my question is how could the government ensure compliance by foreign actors if we went in the direction that you suggested previously?
Well, I'm not sure that you could assure that no matter whom you put the burden on. It will always be difficult if front groups and then front groups beyond front groups can actually take out the ads. It doesn't matter where the burden is placed in that regard. But I would say that one of the problems that I have with the Honest Ads Act is it's placing the burden in no small part on smaller publishers that don't have the financial wherewithal to shoulder that burden, and when they're not the ones that are actually responsible for placing most of those ads.
So let me dive into the detail of that with Mr. Chavern. The Honest Ads Act would apply an FCC-style political file requirement to the largest platforms that sell paid online political ads. It currently defines a large online platform as those with 50 million unique U.S. visitors per month. So I guess I might suggest that might differentiate from the concern that you just raised. I guess, Mr. Chavern, my question is, what's your view on that figure? Do you have a sense of what types of platforms would be captured at that level?
Off the top of my head, it's hard for me to deal with the specific metrics other than clearly at this point in time, there are two large social media platforms that get the bulk of people's attention and ad revenue. That may change over time, by the way, so we will need some metric of size. I would come back to one thing Mr. Rothenberg stated that I certainly agree with. With regard to the Honest Ads Act, with regard to the stated purpose of equal treatment, I think we've talked a lot about that today and how there may be value in that. We're still studying the implications of all the components of it, in particular the repository and database, and what kind of database for any platform, by the way, is required in this new kind of converged digital age. So, but fundamentally, to answer your question, there's two clear candidates right now in terms of online platforms, but we'll have to consider the fact that there may be others and different ones in the future, as there always are.
I can answer that, Mr. Kilmer. It would include companies like Hearst, Condé Nast, Meredith, Vox, Vice Media, basically a lot of newspapers and magazines that are not in a position to take on extra burdens, financial burdens in reporting. 50 million unique users in the internet world is actually not a lot.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, for permission to participate today in the hearing. Thank you for taking this issue as seriously as you have. And also want to thank Ranking Member Kelly for her focus on this. And I want to thank my colleague, Derek Kilmer from Washington, for his leadership on the Honest Ads Act, which I think is a critical step as we prepare for the elections next year. Although it could be next week. It seems like it's coming fast and furious, and that's why we need to get ready for it. I just want to, is there anyone on the panel who thinks that right now we have an adequate level of disclosure with respect to spending on political advertisements on online platforms to be ready for the next election? Does anyone think that disclosure is adequate? Mr. Dickerson. I predicted you would be the one who said you do. But I don't see anybody else. Let the record show. I don't think it's adequate. I think that if we're going to be ready, as you were saying, Mr. Rothenberg, we've got to anticipate what comes next. It's hard sometimes to do that, but I would think putting a baseline regime of disclosure in place with respect to what's happening online would be one thing that we could do to be more ready than we are now. And so we're obviously going to encourage our colleagues to continue to push very hard for this kind of disclosure, which, as the hearing has indicated, is not out of line with the expectations that have been created with respect to the broadcast industry over time. And the public, I think, has indicated through polling data that it wants to see this kind of information as well. I'm curious what you would say about whether advertisers should be allowed to make money from foreign election interference. I mean, how would you answer that question, Mr. Vander Walker? Do you think that advertisers should be able to make money on foreign interference in our elections?
Well, I mean, I think within reason we should be preventing foreign interference in our elections, and it logically follows from that companies shouldn't be able to make a profit from it.
Any others?
Yes, I think the question really needs to be refocused, because the issue is not whether, for example, somebody makes money off an ad, but whether an advertiser that's foreign is permitted to participate in U.S. elections. And I think that is one of the issues that if there is going to be further disclosure requirements needs to be addressed, which is that online platforms like broadcasters have no enforcement authority. If the Boris and Natasha, who've been mentioned before, they say, yes, we're U.S. citizens or we have a U.S. company, they don't, either an online platform or a newspaper or a TV station have no way really to determine whether that's accurate. And that's why I think this has to be a government responsibility.
But I do think it goes to the question of what kind of expectation we should have from the advertisers themselves, what sort of responsibility they should carry to promote this kind of disclosure, to keep track of these kinds of things. I don't think, as you indicated, Mr. Rothenberg, that we can, for example, rely on campaigns to enforce these standards. I don't think that's realistic. I think the advertisers or the platforms that are receiving these purchase advertisements are better positioned to do that. It may not be easy out of the gates to construct these new regimes or algorithms, but they can construct algorithms for just about everything else in the world. They should be able to do this in order to enhance disclosure. I'm going to run out of time, so I wanted to ask one other question of you, Mr. Vander Walker, and that is, you know, the FEC takes a lot of hits these days, and in certain regards it is not functioning in the way it should. But there are some things that the FEC is able to do pretty well. It collects information that's submitted by campaigns every quarter. It digests that, and it produces it in a very accessible way on its online platform, so people can go there and get information about what's happening in terms of the spending on the campaigns themselves. So do you have any reason to think that the FEC would not be able to handle the responsibility of administering what's being envisioned under the Honest Ads Act in terms of information being collected, public files being produced, that being put in a place where the public can see it easily. Isn't that a function that the FEC could undertake at this point?
Yes, as you mentioned, that's one of the things that the FEC is actually good at, and they recently revamped the public face of those disclosures, making them more searchable online, and certainly policies could be developed in cooperation with social medias of the world who are very good at putting things online, I think, to make it all feasible and usable.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize myself for another 5 minutes. Mr. Dickerson, I want to follow up on something Mr. Vander Walker said. Does a Russian in Russia have First Amendment rights in the United States?
A Russian in Russia certainly has fewer First Amendment rights than an American, or than a Russian would have on American soil.
Gotcha. Mr. Goodman, can the government of Russia buy an ad saying, "Come to Moscow," on broadcast television?
There is no restriction which prohibits a foreign government from buying an ad. I think there would be a restriction on them buying an ad which would be explicit advocacy, because that would be illegal under U.S. election laws.
So the Russian government, if they wanted to buy an ad on broadcast that said, "Don't send weapons to Ukraine," what would govern that?
There are disclosure requirements, and I'm certainly no expert in the disclosure requirements with respect to foreign participation in U.S. media. But other than that, assuming they comply with those disclosure requirements, there is no prohibition on their speaking in the U.S.
Does the Foreign Agent Registration Act have anything to do with that disclosure or that purchase of
That's exactly what I was referring to.
Gotcha. Mr. Chavern, can the Russians run a political advertisement in the newspaper saying, "Don't send guns to the Ukraine"?
I believe it would not count as express advocacy,
If they said, call your congressman and tell them don't support sending guns, American guns, to the Ukraine.
To tell you the truth, once you get into issue advocacy, I have the same. I would have the same question as Mr. Goodman about foreign agent.
Mr. Rothenberger, can the Russians run a digital ad that tells you to call your congressman and tell them not to support sending American guns to the Ukraine?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not an expert on that, so I cannot answer that question.
Mr. Vander Walker, do you have an opinion on either one of those three scenarios that I just brought up?
So one of the things that could get at that is the political file requirement, which would, again, not be a prohibition, but would be a disclosure.
So let me ask you, is there some piece of law, court case, that regulates whether the Russian government could buy an ad on print, broadcast, or digital that says, call your congressman and tell them to not send guns to Ukraine?
Not that I'm aware of. Although,
and just for the record, I'm supportive of sending guns to the Ukraine. I just want to make that clear.
Right. I mean, it could be an electioneering communication if it were 60 days within an election and mentioned someone running for re-election.
Mr. Dickerson, your opinion on one of those three scenarios?
I mean, my opinion is, I'm pleased to finally hear the the Foreign Agent Registration Act raised, because it basically is a political file. I mean, this is a law that requires, essentially any, and it's a very broad definition of political public communication at very low dollar thresholds, to be filed with the Department of Justice, to have physical copies of the ad filed with the department, to have a disclaimer on the front of the ad saying it's being paid for by a foreign government. I mean, I think a lot of the tragedy of this conversation is that in our efforts to get at Russian activity, we're ignoring the tool that is directed at foreign actors and instead trying to expand laws that by definition impact American political speech. And given the scope of the existing FARA and the fact that it could be expanded if it was this committee's interest to not only foreign agents but also foreign principals, that strikes me as a much narrower, much more constitutionally defensible way of building the political file that's being discussed here, precisely because it's targeted at foreigners and not Americans.
So right now, your understanding of FARA is that it's for agents of the government. It doesn't include principals of the government.
That's my understanding.
Mr. Raskin, you're now recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I'm going to follow up on your questions. And as I'm listening to the testimony, I recognize that what's at stake here really is the integrity of liberal democracy in our century. You know, Vladimir Putin and his agents understood they could not compete with us militarily, they could not compete with us economically, and they could not compete with us politically on a fair stage because they've got nothing to sell but tyranny and despotism and kleptocracy. But he detected a little bit of an Achilles heel in the United States, which is our openness, and specifically our openness, our freedom of expression on the internet, which might be the most wide open of all of the forums and media that we have. And so he took advantage of that. And I think everybody here agrees that we were caught sleeping. And there were hundreds of thousands of dollars, perhaps millions of dollars spent to invade every nook and cranny of the internet in order to inject poison into our political process and to try to gerrymander the outcome of our election. Now, let me ask this. First of all, can we do this in reverse? For example, would we be allowed to spend whatever money we wanted, either as a government or private entities in the United States, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Russia, in the Philippines? Do the authoritarian societies allow people from the liberal democracies to access their public with such ease? Does anybody have an answer to that? Mr. Rothenberg?
Well, yes, for generations we did that through the Voice of America and various other arms of the United States government, and did it very effectively.
But what about the purchase of TV ads in Saudi Arabia or Iran or Russia, the purchase of radio ads? I understand there is the Voice of America, which is announced, which is disclosed, and it clearly comes from the United States. But what about the kind of surreptitious penetration of the public consciousness that took place in 2016 here?
Well, history shows us that we have all played games in each other's countries with each other's media for generations. I'm not defending it or decrying it. I'm just stating a fact that I think
well, and
there's
there's no
aware
doubt.
of.
Yeah, and there's no doubt the U.S. government has intervened to destabilize democracies, as in Chile, as in Iran, and that's something obviously that real small d Democrats oppose and have tried to stop in our history. But perhaps we need some kind of global understanding about giving the people of every society the right first to free and fair elections in democratic government, and then the right to pursue those elections without covert interference by foreign nations. Well, let me ask this question. The FICA makes it unlawful for any foreign national, directly or indirectly, to make a contribution or donation in connection with a federal, state, or local election. That doesn't use the language of express advocacy. It says any contribution or donation in connection with an election. Would it be within the constitutional authority and province of Congress to ban, and I think perhaps the chairman was asking this question too, not just express advocacy spending by foreign nationals, corporations, and governments, but also any political advertising taking place during the election season? Would we have the authority to do that to foreign nationals on the theory that they don't enjoy the First Amendment rights of the American people, or indeed of, I think, even permanent residents of the country, people who are here and are part of the country? Does anybody have an opinion on that?
Well, I think the problem, Congressman, is less a matter of the First Amendment than a matter of vagueness. I mean, as I know you're aware, the Supreme Court in Buckley said that precisely that language was unconstitutionally vague, in the sense that actors couldn't, as a matter of due process, determine what was and wasn't covered. This is the danger with these sort of words like.
Right. Well, we've drawn a line between express advocacy and then just generalized political advocacy. But because the line exists, we've got two separate categories, and our campaign laws apply for American citizens on one side, but not the other. But perhaps they could apply on both sides for people or entities, foreign governments, and corporations that decide they want to get involved in our elections. What do you think about that?
Well, I think we're already there. I mean, express advocacy is banned by foreigners and foreign governments.
But we want to go beyond that to all political spending during our campaigns. For example, it turns out that the Russian government cleverly got itself involved with alt-right activities. It tried to get involved with Black Lives Matter. It was doing everything possible to exasperate tensions in our country, which we live with to this very day.
I would think the Department of State would have views on this. From the point of view of the First Amendment, that is probably permissible, provided that things are defined in a way that is understandable. And frankly, Congress has a bad track record on that.
And of course, they have the right to speak voluntarily and freely through public platforms where they're announced, and they've got a right to do a Facebook page, which is not the spending of any money. But it just seems to me that when we talk about the expenditure of money in the political system, that's where it gets to be very dangerous, because you can't rerun an election. One contaminated election can take a country down a very dark road. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I recognize myself for another 5 minutes. This set of questions is for Mr. Chavern, Mr. Goodman, Mr. Rothenberg. We'll start with you, Mr. Rothenberg. How much does it cost a month to host a website?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, you can do it for, under $20 a month.
Would Mr. Goodman, Chavern, would you agree about the cost? Are you familiar with WordPress?
Yes, certainly.
How much?
I've had a blog on WordPress.
How much does that cost?
Oh, right now I don't know. It's. I think you can actually go up on WordPress for. There might be a free option.
I believe there is a free option.
Yeah.
When people do advertising on a digital platform, they fill out some form, right? Upload the copy. That form gets stored somewhere, and that's get pushed out, right?
Essentially, it's a good summary.
So there's an electronic record of it?
That I can't speak to. I don't know how evanescent those are or are not.
Could there be an electronic record?
I imagine yes.
Could it get exported to an Excel document or a Google sheet?
I imagine yes. It doesn't sound like it would be that difficult.
And if you already own a website, publishing an Excel document or a Google sheet, how much does that cost?
Give me the question again, sir.
If you already own a website, right, and how much does it cost to publish a Google sheet or an Excel document to that website?
If I already have, say, a WordPress site and I want to, I mean, you can upload that relatively simply.
Yeah,
it's
zero,
de minimis, yeah.
Zero cost, right? So I'm curious, Mr. Goodman, Mr. Chavern, would you disagree with any of those? Or would you agree with Mr. Rothenberg's comments and all that?
Yes.
So I'm curious to know what burden we're putting on someone to publish the information of who's advertising.
Well, first of all, the ads that are going onto my WordPress blog, if I've enabled it to take advertising, are not being bought, not being sold by me directly.
Yeah,
I have nothing to do with it. It's all an automated backend.
So what is the burden that we are putting on the person that is displaying that ad on your individual website?
Well, the way, one of my concerns, as I expressed before, with the way the Honest Ads Act is worded, it would put the burden on me to keep those records.
So what is the burden?
Even though I have no involvement in the actual sale or distribution of that advertising.
And I know it's hard to address everyone, right? And I get that. But are they expunging all that information? The people that are collecting the advertising dollars on what's being promoted? Or
presumably they have it, but you're asking me to keep the records. And I don't have any of those records.
So the person that has the record, what burden would it be for them to publish The details of that?
That I don't know. It depends upon who it is and where they are in the system.
Mr. Goodman, do you have an opinion on when it comes to broadcast?
I think there are two questions. One is, if you ask who is paying for the ad, that is what broadcasters already do. There is a considerable amount of complaint that that isn't really that informative. In other words, if it's Citizens for Good Government, who actually that is not clear.
And the broadcaster goes back and asks and say, who's your counsel or who's your executive committee, and they don't give you an answer. I get that.
Yeah, so
I'm not asking for enforcement. I'm asking what burden is there to publish the information, the data that is already in hand?
The information is currently uploaded to websites that are really run by the FCC, and it is proven not to be a very significant burden to most TV stations.
Gotcha. Mr. Treverne?
Yeah, the one thing I'd note is in the website example you gave, obviously the website viewed by you would have some sets of ads. If I viewed the same website, they might likely have a totally different set of ads served programmatically by the ad tech platforms. So I think you also have to take into account volume. And again, these programmatic systems have no human touch related to them. And the volume of ads and deciding, for example, what
is it the same amount of effort to publish a 10-line Excel document or spreadsheet as it is to publish a 10 million line? I know the answer.
Okay.
Same level of effort. Because you're not collecting it, right? If you're collecting the information automatically, right? So to display it, there's no difference in displaying 10 lines versus a million lines.
Okay. Well,
now you may have to pay for the size of the file, but I'm getting at, I keep hearing over and over, the burden to publish data that is already in hand. You already have the data. What's the burden?
It's where you're placing the burden. If you're placing the burden on a place that's
on whoever has it, who's collecting it?
Okay, that depends upon how you write the requirements.
Exactly. Mr. Dickerson, do you have any opinion on all this exchange? Mr. Vander Walker?
No, I'm excited to hear the answers.
Parting wisdom. I don't have any time left, but I'll extend some of that time to y'all. 10 seconds, Mr. Vander Walker, what is it that you wish this committee would know about this topic that you haven't been able to address? And that's the same question for all y'all. Mr. Dickerson, it better be good because you're going to be last, okay? And you don't have to say anything. If the answer is we got it all, we got it all.
I think the committee got it all from our perspective.
Great.
Thank you.
Mr. Rothenberg.
I think industry self-regulation, managed industry-wide with tough and tight enforcement, can actually go further than this Congress can go in enforcing the rules.
I think that whatever you do, it needs to be clear so that the rules are understandable and the responsibility for enforcement is also well established.
Let's take this moment to figure out what rules about political advertising make sense no matter what the platform. And that doesn't mean being caught by what happened before. Let's take this moment to say what really makes sense and what do we need.
Mr. Dickerson, don't let me down.
The courts have allowed us to establish disclosure requirements, record-keeping burdens, things of this nature, only insofar as the underlying speech is directed at an election. And to the extent that we are toying with using foreign intervention, which we can separately regulate, as an excuse to undo that burden, I think we are wading into territory that is far less charted than some of the testimony has suggested.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you all for being here today and appearing before us. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. And if there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.